Russia has been conspicuous by the lack of reverse support for the Iranians in terms of their trouble in the Middle East with the Israelis. Actually, for a long time, there was a kind of tacit Israeli-Russian deal over Syria. Um, and that seems to have sort of come to an end now. The Russians have not come to the aid of the Iranians, and that won't have gone unnoticed in Tehran.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, today we're privileged to be talking to Matthew Savill, MBE. Matthew is Director of Military Sciences at RUSI, focuses on developments and trends in modern conflict and the use of force in the 21st century. If ever there was an expert in things that are being adapted, he is the expert. But before joining RUSI, he spent 20 years as a civil servant working on defence and security, predominantly in the Ministry of Defence. Matthew, welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you very much. I mean, you're far too generous. Obviously, what I often do is use the vast expertise that my team have to sound clever.
Well, RUSI is one of those organizations that's full of vast expertise, but who can predict what's been happening around the world at the minute? And we're recording this on Friday afternoon, and last night we had Israel carry out a massive attack on Iran. Over 300 aircraft, they say, were involved, attacking Iranian nuclear sites, including the Nance research and reactor facility, and effectively decapitating the high command of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. What do you make of it? What do you think has happened here, and what do you think the response is going to be?
Yeah, I mean, the political drivers are confusing, and I'm trying to kind of peel back some of that. And this is a classic area where many of the other teams at RUSI have sort of come together to look at this, because obviously we've got people that look at geopolitical issues, and we've got people who look at nuclear issues. I'm largely focused on the military activity. Um, the timing is interesting because it's not clear if this was coordinated with the US in the way that is now being claimed, in terms of, if you like, being the coercive bit after Trump's deadline to the Iranians, or whether or not they have decided to somewhat go it alone and Trump has decided to swing behind them, because it looks like it's been successful. I would say that this is an attempt to push back the Iranian nuclear program by inflicting considerable damage on it. But it has also had a pretty wide target set in terms of Iranian military officials, government advisors, and military sites. And that looks a lot like something that is both intended to cripple or at least undermine a potential Iranian response, but also, frankly, undermine the stability of the regime itself, to threaten it by making it look weak. In terms of what we know, it's relatively little. It is still being sifted through. I think there are some very good open source researchers out there who are now pulling up images. It has hit essentially command facilities to take out senior officials, and particularly hit the IRGC's aerospace forces. The IGC, of course, parallels the conventional forces in many respects, but it has hit the head of Iran's armed forces as well, so he's dead, apparently. It has hit ballistic missile facilities, and then in terms of nuclear facilities, the images are still coming through, but they seem to have gone after, in particularly, the facilities in and around Natanz, and so it's not a reactor site. It's an enrichment site, which is partly underground and partly above ground. Um, there are other sites there. They haven't hit the full range of Iran's nuclear program, so they haven't gone near there is a reactor. There is a deep buried enrichment site underneath a mountain, but this looks like it's the opening salvo in what might be days or even weeks worth of strikes, which are basically intended to take advantage of Iran's current weakness, the damage that's been done to its proxy network and its, air defense network, and basically hammer home Israel's massive conventional superiority to put the Iranians fundamentally back in the box, and maybe, encourage them to give up on their nuclear ambitions, although we can discuss what those actually are.
Well, yes. Now, if we peel back in time a little bit and look at some of the indicators that have gone on, Iran was attacked by Israel before, where Israel attacked Iran's um, air defense capability and removed a lot of that. That was almost a precursor because there didn't seem to be much of a fight from Iran with the Israeli air forces going in. President Trump, whenever he was talking to Vladimir Putin about peace deals and peace settlements in Ukraine, in his conversation on the telephone, talked to Vladimir Putin and asked him to ensure that Iran did not get a weapon that could destroy Israel. That wasn't covered well in the press. We then get Iran in the last 10 days saying that they have perfected a missile capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, and that gets put out publicly. And then we get the International Atomic Energy Authority, the United Nations organization, only yesterday turning around and saying Iran is days away from having sufficient enriched uranium to make a nuclear warhead. All of those seem to have been indicators that would suggest Israel had two options: the one it took last night, or to put a mushroom cloud over Tehran. It chose the lesser of the two. But do you think that there is more to come?
I think what will be interesting is what actually triggered this, because there's a lot of smoke and mirrors around what's actually going on in the Iranian program. And to a degree, that is deliberate ambiguity intended to increase their leverage. If you try and build up what we know over the years, we know that they had a weaponization program early on, and that was essentially stopped or finished in the early 2000s. But they had gleaned a lot of the knowledge from that about how to build a viable warhead. And then they expanded throughout the early 2000s their enrichment program and their understanding of enrichment, which is how you get the fissile material that enables you to detonate a nuclear device. And that was what created the biggest concern, along with their developments in their ballistic missile program, that led to the original Iran nuclear deal, which didn't eliminate all of this, but it basically put in place, if you're a supporter of the deal, a framework that stopped um, the high level enrichment, that put in place a monitoring mechanism to essentially mean that they couldn't stay in the deal and advance their program, and effectively gave everybody, years whilst the uranium program was fundamentally paused. But it wasn't a complete solution. And what happened when the Americans pulled out of that deal was that the Iranians, slowly at first and then increasingly, basically stopped abiding um, by the terms of the deal. And the core problem is that they began to massively increase their enrichment of uranium beyond the point at which you need it for a civilian program, basically to try and blackmail people. Hey, look, we're building this stockpile up. In parallel, what came out was that they hadn't declared all of their program, and so there were lots of things that they had tried to hide and clean up in the background. And that kind of is where we got to recently, which is that they have built up this large stockpile of high enriched uranium, not yet at weapons grade, but not hard to get to weapons grade. And they were essentially refusing to comply with the IAEA's investigation into what their program looks like now and what they had done previously. And so that was why they were declared in breach of their obligations under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. Um, so in terms of their knowledge of nuclear issues and their stockpile of high enriched uranium, it doesn't seem like anything changed there recently. But it sounds like fundamentally that there was both an opportunity for the Israelis and their tolerance of the risk. Basically, their patience had run out. If you're cynical, they were also concerned that maybe the Iranians and US were going to reach a deal, but on unsatisfactory terms. And all of that came together. to basically lead to where we are now. I mean, there is an alternative interpretation, which it was all a kind of cunning plan with the US. I think the jury's a little bit out.
Well, Israel and the US working together, but then second guessing what Donald Trump is going to do. Those are the sorts of things that even us, no matter how good we are at analysis, I don't think we can ever work that out properly when you bring in the Trump factor. But the one thing that I think it does do, and getting us onto the subject that I wanted to talk about in the first place, it does do is it stops Iran, I think, wanting or having the wherewithal to support Russia in the way it's done beforehand. With physical supplies of Shahad drones, it supplied the technologies of the Shahad drones and Russia's manufacturing a lot of them, but also then ballistic missiles and other military material support, because Russia is relying on external suppliers because it can't keep up with what it needs itself. Do you think that this will impact Iran's ability to continue to support Russia with its war in Ukraine?
I think there's an interesting tension in the relationship there, which is that Russia has been conspicuous by the lack of reverse support for the Iranians in terms of their trouble in the Middle East with the Israelis. Actually, for a long time, there was a kind of tacit Israeli Russian deal over Syria. Um, and that seems to have sort of come to an end now. The Russians have not come to the aid of the Iranians, and that won't have gone unnoticed in Tehran. But I imagine they were a bit skeptical of that anyway. I think, unfortunately for Ukraine, the most significant utility of the relationship between Iran and Russia might have been past, which is, of course, that the Russians have now got their own facilities for producing um, duplicates of the Shahed, particularly the larger Shahed drones. It's the Geran, and they've begun to duplicate this facility, so there's more than one in Russia now. I think that the Russians obviously would welcome input of ballistic missiles, but they have a reasonable number of their own and have been increasing production levels slowly, but more over time. The big external support is components and things that get smuggled in that come from China, and is the massive support that North Korea has supplied in terms of raw numbers of artillery shells. And so I think if we are hoping that Iran being more inwardly concerned now is going to lead to a significant change in the balance of forces in Russia and Ukraine's war, that's probably optimistic.
Okay, interesting. But there's that drone link, and this gets me into something that you were quoted at last weekend in the Sunday Times. You quoted it saying, I think the headline said, "Killer drones are changing war and may soon think for themselves." The Ukraine war has irrevocably changed the dynamics and geography of the battlefield, because the front line is now over a range that FPV drones can operate rather than direct fire and certain indirect fire weapons. But from your perspective, and for the listeners out there, what were you saying in the article? What has changed? What is changing, and where do you think the future lies?
Yeah, and I think I should caveat this with, of course, that was the thrust of the article. I was introducing a little bit of what I think is caution about how we're dealing with drones, but there could be more profound changes down the line when you combine them with artificial intelligence. What we've seen in Ukraine is that drones have been of different kinds, have been supplementing and augmenting what can be done with conventional with standard munitions. Um, and in many respects, they have uh, been a cheaper alternative, but not a full replacement. Um, but that cheapness has been a huge boon. I mean, when we say drone, we are covering everything from something that you might actually call a loitering munition, something that looks, I mean, we've talked all about first-person view drones and particularly fiber optic. So these are very small explosive warheads that are flown around on a quadcopter or similar, trailing a cable behind them to an operator, and they do that because you can then avoid jamming. A lot of you might say experienced and mature military personnel might ask, what is the real difference between that and a wire-guided anti-tank missile that has been around for decades? Um, And some of these things that we're calling one-way attack drones, well, aren't they basically missiles? Aren't they really cheap cruise missiles in some respects? But it's that the ability, the if you like, the price point efficiency of getting an explosive somewhere over long distances that means that Ukrainian defense industry has begun to increasingly churn these out. And similarly, the Russians, having copied the Shaheds from Iran, aren't having to use all of their stockpiles of air-launched cruise missiles because they can just send waves of fairly large, reasonably accurate drones to try and exhaust expensive Ukrainian air defenses. The bit that is really changing is around the front line, the land and the ground or the near ground battle, which is that the expansion in the volume of drones combined with essentially surveillance systems, which are themselves often uncrewed, means that the area around the front line is becoming incredibly dangerous. It's becoming hard to maneuver. Armored vehicles get picked off. There is talk of the battlefield becoming more transparent, not completely transparent, because we can talk about the limitations of lots of these things, but it's becoming a lot easier to spot something and then very quickly strike it. Now, early on, a lot of that was striking it with artillery and long range artillery and other precision weapons. But combining these things together now means that you've kind of got a 15, well, 10 but increasing kilometers zone either side of the front where it's really, really hard to maneuver. And given that lots of military theory still holds concentration of fighting power is really important, massing your forces before you strike, that means it's temporarily very hard to attack in large numbers.
Well, it's interesting, and we should learn the lessons of history. The Shahad 136 is a small version of the V1 Doodlebug, almost different propulsion, different scale, different accuracies, and all the rest of it. And then we come through the Cold War in the 60s, and we had the CL 289 artillery spotting rocket propelled drone that would go out and they take wet film, and I remember having to have it developed and look at it and all the rest of it. So drone technology was always there, but it's changing the battlefield. But we're hearing a lot of people who are discussing how military equipment's changing and what people should be purchasing and looking at the future. And one of the comments that seems to come out quite consistently is heavy armor is now dead. Yeah, and that would be, if you looked at just what is happening in Ukraine, backed up by physically what's happening on the battlefield. If you're in armor, it's easy to spot. It's easy to hit with these cheap drones. And if you're in old Soviet-style armor, you're dead. If you're in Western armor, at least you'll survive, but the armor's not going to work anywhere. Is armor dead?
I mean, that's the question we're grappling with. I, I mean, there's not a RUSI view. There are individual researchers. Armor still has a place on the battlefield, but in the um, weapon capability countermeasure battle, armor's having a really tough time of it at the moment, and that's because lots of these vehicles are still working out how to be upgraded to make them more survivable. You still need to move people around the battlefield. The best way to do that is still in a vehicle, and if you want to protect those people, you still need armor on that vehicle. Otherwise, you're walking to the fight, and you're doing that from miles and miles away. What's happening at the moment, though, is the question is, well, how do we protect these vehicles? And is that making them lighter and more mobile? In other words, maybe armor is literally not the answer, and we've seen increasingly these sort of motorbike or quad bike assaults. Or is it that the vehicles need to be equipped differently, and the way that they are used is different, and you need to protect them a lot more? And that can be with electronic warfare and jamming. There can be an element of deception. There can be with active defenses. I think the caution that we've had with lots of the armors being taken out by, a tank costs this much and a drone costs this much, is that in many cases what you see is the final drone that destroys the vehicle. But there might have been a dozen drone strikes to destroy a heavy armored vehicle like a tank. In the same way that in Iraq, rocket propelled grenades, RPGs, We know of Challenger tanks that took multiple RPG hits and still kept on going. Um, what some of these drones bring is incredible precision, but you've got to stop the vehicle moving or immobilize it. Sometimes that's done with mines, sometimes it's done with artillery. Um, but yes, armored vehicles are having a tougher time.
Hmm. But then is there a danger that if we look at the battlefield in Ukraine, it is not the way we envisage a battlefield from a Western perspective. The Ukrainians don't have an all arms, and the Russians are not utilizing an all arms approach. They're utilizing their armored vehicles as battlefield taxis in onesie twosies. They're using their heavy tanks as effectively long range anti-armor guns in places in onesie twosies. They're not massing, and they're not massing it under um, uh, 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 a local air superiority, and within that I include a local electronic warfare bubble of superiority around the armored force that you're trying to punch through in a mass type situation. We've seen none of that. So none of the tactics that we would expect to use from the West have been used in Ukraine, but we're trying to learn lessons about armored warfare when it's completely different.
What we need to do is understand what is possible and then how that would affect how we plan to fight. I mean, so that cuts both ways. The first is no, NATO wouldn't fight this way, and therefore the way that we would be affected by these weapons isn't necessarily the same. There is a bit of a danger that what you do is you overcompensate and go, well, we wouldn't fight this way, so we wouldn't be caught out. Well, we do still need to think about how we would integrate drones into our doctrine. We don't have anywhere near the volume that the Ukrainians have, and we're still learning it. And secondly, we are very vulnerable at the moment. We have very few counter drone systems. So it's all very well saying, oh, well, active defense, which is essentially things that you put on your armored vehicles that in some cases might fire something at an incoming drone, like it were an anti tank missile. Well, we don't fit active defenses to most of our vehicles. There probably will be one on the next generation of Challenger, the Challenger 3, but they're not fitted to Boxer and Ajax and all of this sort of thing at the moment. So we need to be careful of well, we're not concerned about that because we wouldn't fight that way. The enemy gets a vote and they might compel us to fight differently. And there is enormous work going on in the British Army at the moment on how does this change how we would need to fight? Where can we take advantage of this technology? And where do we need to change how we operate so that we are less vulnerable? Because if we want to continue to fight the way that we plan to, we are going to have to adapt our defenses. Otherwise, we will be just as badly affected, if not more so.
Well, yes, I think training our infantry in skeet shooting and having more shotguns around would help for close-in defense and bits and pieces. But there must be an awful lot of major lessons that you're picking up from a RUSI perspective from what's going on in the battles across Ukraine. What are the ones, and are we right to learn from them, or is there a danger that as we've always done before, we're learning the lessons from the last conflict and trying to equip ourselves and prepare ourselves for that rather than taking it and looking forward to what the next conflict could be and trying to get ahead of the game?
I think there's a difference between what do we think is happening in Ukraine and how do we apply it bit of, as you say, learning lessons. A lot of it isn't new. But it has been an unfortunate, if you like, reminder that things that we knew were important, but we basically took a lot of risk on, are still important. So electronic warfare, I don't think at any point anybody would say, "Oh, electronic warfare is not a thing." But as you will know, because we were operating under circumstances where we fundamentally didn't face much in the way of jamming or spoofing or interference with our communication systems, where we had free reign over the electromagnetic spectrum, when resources were tight, we didn't invest in EW. Um, and, something that we knew from the Cold War. Well, guess what? Ukraine has reminded us, no, that is really important. And given that everything that we do is about sensors and spotting the adversary, electronic warfare is back and we need to reinvest in it. And that's true in the air as well, because we've got such a reliance on precision munitions that we need to make sure we can fight our way through adversary jamming and spoofing and and camouflage. And so, on the one hand, that's obvious, and I don't think anybody in the British Army would ever have said this will never be a problem for us again. But we cut lots of those capabilities, or we minimized them, um, because we didn't need it. We didn't need to worry about it, and we need to put electronic warfare not just in sort of small specialty units, but like what Ukraine has shown is you need to push that understanding throughout the force, down levels, so that your very small tactical units are capable of understanding and operating in difficult electromagnetic circumstances.
Hmm. Now, one of the things that we've also seemed to have got wrong when we're looking at it is our assessment of Russian capabilities. They were supposedly the second most powerful military in the world. We were developing newer and newer weapon systems because they would not penetrate the frontal armor of the T-90 or the experimental T-14 Armata and other things. You're a former defense intelligence. I've worked. I can't remember whether we've actually physically worked together before, but we're looking at that. We all seem to have got our assessments wrong. Even the Germans were saying, whenever the Russians first went into Ukraine 3 years ago, that it's only going to last a couple of days because the Russians are so big and powerful. How did we get it so wrong? And how do we adjust our assessment process to ensure we don't do that against future enemies again?
I mean, this is really tough. I mean, of course, we worked together in Basra. I think we overlapped. But of course, we were looking at terrorists and insurgents and kind of local dynamics. Um, there is a live debate over about actually understanding. I mean, there's how did we get it wrong, or did people get it wrong at the point of the invasion, and what assessment has been made since? So this is like a huge subject in and of its own right. If the question is, why were people pessimistic about Ukraine's chances early on in a way that has turned out not to be accurate? I think we need to be careful about actually parsing what lots of people said and why they said it. Um, Most of the judgment I've seen, which a lot of people said were wrong, um, weren't predicting a Russian takeover all of Ukraine. What they focused on was, can the Russians decapitate the government or get to Kyiv? And I think it's worth noting there that a lot of the judgments there were based on a kind of rough assessment of the balance of forces. And the truth was, Kyiv was vulnerable, it was close to the border. Most of the best Ukrainian forces were out in the east, and there was enough Russian forces building up there that they wouldn't be able to withdraw back and protect Kyiv. So they were going to be pinned in the east. And then we had this large build up to basically rush towards Kyiv. And the view was that they would probably be able to get there. I mean, they had a historically high um, balance of forces in their favor around Kyiv, because I think the two things that made a difference were, one, um, the Ukrainians weren't. I mean, the Ukrainians didn't believe the Russians were going to be invading. I mean, people forget that Zelensky was in Munich, and a lot of this was because they didn't want to panic people. But I was in government at the time, and the Ukrainians were largely speaking rejecting our analysis that the Russians were going to invade, which meant they prepared very late, very late dispersal of their air defenses, very late attempts to mobilize and hand out weapons to what became quite important, essentially civilian militias. RUSI had researchers in country a week beforehand, I think, and were all being told that they were wrong, that the Russians were going to invade. And so there was pessimism that the Ukrainians would be ready in time. I think the other really big thing that made a difference is we didn't realize that the Russians didn't know they were invading. Which is, it transpires that most of the Russian invasion forces thought that they were massing for an exercise and weren't actually properly invading. And so, what on paper, through various Zapad exercises, looked like an improved Russian force, started tripping over itself and like fundamentally moved in a way that was not very competent. And then some things went in Ukraine's favor, that, the flooding of various areas to canalize them, the Russian logistics incompetence, which meant they kind of piled up on the road to Kyiv, the failure to take Hostomel. And once all that started going wrong, I think we realized that their plan was built on such fine margins that it kind of fell apart in the face of fierce Ukrainian resistance, and that's why they have reverted to this very attritional approach, which is where they just pour in more resources than they think the Ukrainians can sustain. I think the other thing, and sorry, this is a very long answer, is that what we've got at the moment is a very odd Russian army, which is that the general view of my land research is that the infantry are really poor quality. They're not learning in terms of infantry assault. They are very heedless of their casualties because they don't care about it. It is a brutal existence where they put people literally on crutches back into the front line for these assault forces, and they just throw them in like it's a meat grinder. That's alongside, though, bits of the Russian military, which are really part of this incredibly sophisticated backwards and forwards on the use of drones, where the Russians, uh, are trying to gain an advantage in FPV use and are using jamming and spoofing in different ways to challenge the Ukrainians, and where bits of the Russian military are really involved in this cutting edge battle about how to gain an advantage on the battlefield. And you could look at the Ukrainian Air Force, like some of what the Russian Air Force, some of what the Russian Air Force does is kind of baffling to researchers about why they not been able to achieve air control yet. Why have they not been able to kind of break through, in some cases, Ukrainian air defenses? On the other hand, they're able to launch these very large attacks using a range of long range missiles, and they have put real pressure on Ukrainian infrastructure. So you've got a really odd Russian military where you have pockets of excellence combined with pockets of, very low basic quality.
So you look at that now. Looking at the Ukrainian tactics, and this is sort of the final question I want to touch on today. Ukrainians seem to be teaching us lessons on unconventional warfare. General Bodanov from the HUR and the leaders of the SBU, the Ukrainian security services, have taken the old SOE, the Special Operations Executive handbooks, and written them in modern language and modern tactics, with Operation Spider's Web, that very audacious attack against the Russian strategic bombers using drones launched from the back of trucks with false roofs in houses that were being transported around the place, or buildings that were transported around. We've seen the same out of grain trucks on trains attacking an armor a train carrying lots of armor. We've seen further attacks on the Kirch Bridge, possibly from an unmanned submarine going in, or certainly audacious special forces type operations. We're seeing assassinations of generals in Moscow. Ukraine seems to have gained a degree of operational momentum from that perspective, using novel tactics. Is this something that we should learn about and we should try and bring into our own tactical lessons for the future?
I mean, the first thing is that people should be reassured we have a lot of incredibly inventive, clever, and imaginative people in our, intelligence services, in the Ministry of Defence, within UK Special Forces, who pretty much can't talk about what they do or how they think about doing it. But what you are seeing is the imperative of war, and an existential one, combined with a high degree of essentially political freedom and latitude, turning into these imaginative, daring, you might say risk-taking operations. That when you combine those things, the the resources, the wherewithal, the imagination, and the freedom, you can do a lot. Oh, it also helps if you've got a land border with the country who's attacking you. We should remember that. Um, and then you can draw parallels with the Israelis here, like the Israelis planning in the long term, you know, the operation overnight. There, I forgot to mention, it sounds like there was a Mossad element. They're incredibly inventive, but they're involved in a war fundamentally, a shadow war, and they're given a lot of freedom to operate. Um, and I think we should definitely look at how they are applying technology, but I've no doubt we've got people who could do that if we were in a similar situation, and that freed up the constraints that exist. Like, I used to be a policy official. I'm the kind of person who either gives that freedom once ministers have directed it, or puts in place a constraint. It's the circumstances um, that do it. I think the caution here is these have all been hugely morale boosting operations. I think they are intended to send a message that Ukraine is in this fight. I think it's intended to complicate Russian decision making and to get inside their heads and say that they are not safe anywhere. The jury is out on what impact they're having. Ukraine's been launching long-range drone strikes into Russia for probably 2 years now. They've scored some big successes in hitting large ammunition sites, in hitting production sites, in hitting the Russian industrial military industrial complex. That has hurt, but it hasn't yet actually seriously undermined the operation in Ukraine. Uh, the Russians have been launching massive airstrikes. The recent operation took out maybe, I think, what we can kind of confirm, probably 10 or 15% of that big bomber force, most of which they can't replace. That's pretty impressive. But they're still capable of launching these very large raids. Um, these kind of operations probably need time, and a long time, to eat into the Russian machine. This is kind of the other lesson of Ukraine, which is like, if you have mass, you can have a lot of resilience and you can achieve a lot even if you're not that sophisticated. So I think these operations are important for how they contribute to the war effort. Um, but it's unlikely they're going to be war winning on their own, but they play an important role in the campaign.
Well, the good thing about them is that they give us lots of things to talk about. And from what you're saying, I don't think we're anywhere near close to the end of this conflict and other conflicts around the world. But Matthew, it's been a real pleasure talking to you this afternoon on Frontline.
Thank you, and good to see you again.